Welcome, everyone. I'm Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the museum. Thanks for coming tonight. It's always nice on the holiday season to see so many faces, so thank you all for coming. I'm very excited about this program tonight, which I'll explain in a little bit. But first and foremost, I wanted to thank the staff and the crew for putting all this together, our trustees, our members. If you're not a member, you can go to the website and be a member. I always have to ask for that because it's support from members and donors that make us put us in a place like this where we can put on programs that hopefully will motivate your thinking and help you think a little bit about the future. The mission at the museum has evolved in the last little while. For those who haven't been to a program lately, there's a couple of people I just ran into who haven't. We focus on decoding technology, the computing past, where we get our agency, the digital present, which is the life we live today, and the future impact on humanity. We want to err on the side of educating people of how to shape a better future, but we won't avoid the conversation about difficult topics, of which there are many today, as you all know. This is a special night for all sorts of reasons. And I'm going to start by making the point that I want to introduce Marguerite Gong-Hancock, who will introduce the program tonight. And if I could ask the folks in the back on the AV to click things forward. I'm going to introduce Marguerite through a tradition that she has started at this institution, because Marguerite is about to retire from CHM. And this will be her last program. She'll be leaving at the end of the month. She's had an incredible run here. And she brought many, many firsts to the museum. In fact, it was her programmatic effort, I guess about 8 years ago that I was, maybe 9 years ago, that I was invited to, that led me to believe that this could be a place that I could consider being involved. And so her thinking and creativity is exceptional, and it is left an indelible mark on the institution that will carry on as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to introduce Marguerite, who will then in turn introduce the program. But I'm going to do this through 5 numbers, which is one of Marguerite's traditions. So, a few things to know about Marguerite. It's been 9 years, I was guessing 8 or 9. It's been 9 years that she's been a leader here at CHM. And as I said, her work motivated me to believe that we were going to do a little more than collect and preserve things, but instead talk about the broader implications of computing on the society that we all live in. As I said, she's the first in so many different areas to champion various programs at the institution. The Exponential Center, which she founded and created, which talks about founders and entrepreneurs. She founded the first traveling exhibit in coordination with the Kauffman Foundation, among others, and things like that. So she's had a long history of firsts. But the really big numbers start right here. She did a whole host of interviews with founders and venture capitalists. This institution has the largest collection of venture capital oral histories in the world. We received the collection. We had our own, which Marguerite helped engineer, and you can see she did 33 interviews, including the founders of Intuit, the founders of YouTube, and I could go down the list. There's probably 6 or 8 more. But the National Venture Capital Association was about to make a choice to give their collection to the Smithsonian Institution. And guess who got it? We did, and it's thanks to Marguerite and her work and commitment. It's the first institution in the country, museum, to have a center dedicated to understanding the correlation between founders and funders and how those things come together. So, in our oral history collection, we have, Art Rock talking to Gordon Moore. Nobody else has got things like that. And it's all, again, thanks to Marguerite bringing that together. 96 events.
That's awesome.
That's an unbelievable number. And I think the number, I'd have to look at my sheet, I think it's something like 30 or so that she moderated herself. So she organized and did all the legwork associated with that. So while this may be overly long for my traditional welcoming of Marguerite on stage, I'd like you to join me in thanking her for what she's done for the museum. She's always going to be a friend, and we're never going to let her go. But again, this will be the last time she'll be on stage to kick off a program. So please welcome Marguerite to the stage. And usually we do this, but tonight we can do this too.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thanks,
Marguerite.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And maybe the one that I'd like to say the number one is one grateful heart for being part of the CHM team and community. So thank you for that. But we're here not to talk about me, but to talk about really important ideas with two amazing people on stage. What if one of the Valley's most significant ways of impact was not about the products that we make, but about the way we make them? In other words, the culture, the people, the behaviors and norms of the organizations of the companies here. Well, here to talk about that provocative hypothesis are two amazing people, and it's my pleasure to introduce both of them. First, Andrew McAfee. He studies how technological progress makes a difference in the world, not only through technology and economy and society. He's the principal research scientist at MIT in the Sloan School of Management and co-founder and co-director of the MIT's initiative on the digital economy. You might know him as well as the co-author of some best-selling books, New York Times bestseller, The Second Machine Age, as well as the author of More from Less. And of course, tonight's focus, the Geek Way. So continuing our tradition, I'll introduce Andy through 5 numbers. 1/3 is the percent of the US public company value creation in the 21st century that's happened here in Northern California or Silicon Valley. Second, the machine age that we're in, according to one of the books he's co-authored. 3, the age that he enrolled in Montessori. 14, the size in square meters of his first kite, not kiteboard, kite, even more impressive. And in case you want to write this down, 4321 is his PIN number. He promises that's true for his ATM. So please join me in giving Andy a very warm CHM welcome. Great to have you here. So who would be the best person to be the interlocutor for this conversation? None other than Carl Bass. He's part of the book and has been a great conversationalist and idea person with Andy. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's a former president, CEO of Autodesk. He served on many boards, including Zendex, Planet, Box, Built Robotics, as well as the Smithsonian's Cooper Hewitt. And here are Carl's 5 numbers. 10 years to get a BA in mathematics. I think there's a story behind that. 100 million plus the number of users of Autodesk software. 50 plus boards and advisory roles that he serves on currently. And 50 years designing and building all kinds of things, including woodworking, and 2, not 1, but 2, nuclear fusion reaction. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Carl Bass. Great to have you here.
We meet again.
And the pleasure is I finally get to ask the questions instead of you always asking. But I'm just stunned that an MIT professor, digital economy, 4321, that's the best you could do?
Don't tell anybody.
Okay, anyhow. I'm looking for your wallet right now.
You can tell this is going to be a deadly serious conversation,
Exactly.
Right? The tone has been set.
Okay, so I first just want to open up with just a couple short remarks. So I first met Andy, this is about 10 years ago, when a mutual friend, Tim O'Reilly, and I'm giving Tim a tour of this gallery, and I'm talking to him about generative design, the future of AI, and how it's going to impact work. And Tim is listening, and I think we're engaging in a really good conversation. And somewhere in the middle, he kind of interrupts me. And what he politely says is, you need to meet my friend Andy and his friend Eric.
Eric, who's here.
And he said, you got to meet Andy and Eric. And what he was politely saying is, your BS is kind of interesting, but here's two guys who actually know what they're talking about, have researched and have been really rigorous and really thorough, and you would do better by listening to them than just continuing.
You know that at the same time, literally, I reached out to Tim because you had written something. I think it had appeared in Wired.
Okay.
And I reached out to Tim. Eric and I were doing our research, and we were
okay.
like, can we talk to this guy, Carl? Because we think he really knows what he's talking about.
So Tim is really a Yenta. I didn't
Yep,
realize.
absolutely.
Oh, so that's kind of perfect. The other thing I was going to say is why I was interested in this book is I was CEO, senior leadership positions at Autodesk for 15 or 20 years. And when I became CEO, well, the first thing that happens when you become CEO, particularly when you're promoted from within, is you become instantly funnier and smarter. And like first day, I was way funnier than I had ever been before. But the other thing that happened is I took the job thinking, oh, a CEO job's all about making important decisions and and as a result, it's making big decisions, it's hiring the right people, and culture is a byproduct. Fast forward 15 years later, and I'm 180 degrees opposite. I realized that the only thing you really do, the only thing that's really important is the culture that you set. And then the big decisions and the people you hire are all a consequence of that.
And one of the quotes from yours that's in the book is when you said, by the end, you felt like you were making essentially no real decisions. There were very, very few.
By the way, I think it's a testament to the better you do at the first job, the more you do that. Although I got to tell you, what's really uncanny is I read a draft of this book, and in the last couple days I've been cramming, and so I listened to it on tape. It's really weird when your own name comes up on a recording on the radio.
Carl Bass.
Carl Bass says. And I'm like, what did he say? And you really
Did you lean forward to hear your own words?
Exactly. So anyhow, I've read your other books. I read the books you've written with Eric. Can you just tell us all, why did you? This is a different one.
Yeah, this is
it's distinctly different.
Yep.
It's not like the others. The others were really solidly based in economics.
The others were a little more rigorous. Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Just like you were before. So why'd you write this one?
Let me answer that question by showing you instead of telling you. But first of all, thank you all for coming out. This means a huge amount. It's great to see you here. I've got friends and familiar faces in the audience, and I'm super grateful. I want to thank our host at the Computer History Museum, which is one of the nerd meccas on the planet. This is great. And even though, Carl, you and I are going to bust on each other on stage for most of the evening, I've learned a ton from you over the decade that we've been yelling at each other. I've interviewed you for several books, and you found your words and your ideas in this one. So thank you for all of that, and thank you for being here tonight. This is fantastic.
You should save some of that till we're done.
No. I want to get it out while I still might mean it.
I appreciate that, Andy.
Okay, so let me try to answer the question about why I wrote this book, and I want to do it by drawing some visualizations. This is not a data-heavy evening, but I want to show you some evidence about what's been happening in the American economy, which I think is kind of a big deal. So could I get the first picture up here? You all see two clumps, right? This is a representation of the 100 largest companies in America by market cap, public companies, at the end of 2002. So there are 100 bubbles on this slide. Each bubble is a company. The area of the bubble is proportional to the market cap of the company as of the end of 2002. So far, so good. The 100 bubbles are divided into two clumps. There's the West Coast clump, kind of where we sit now, and there's the entire rest of the country in the other clump, right? You see, the West Coast clump is not as big in 2002. There are only 3 states involved. You'll notice that the bubbles are shaded. The greener the bubble is, the younger the company is. So the gray bubbles are older companies. And then finally, if you look carefully, you'll notice that some bubbles have a dark border around them. The dark border means tech, classically defined. You make hardware, you make software, you make chips or something like that. Got it? So that's where we were with America's large companies at the end of 2002. There was a healthy clump of green bubbles on the West Coast. There's a great big one called Microsoft. But most of the big companies in America were elsewhere. Like you can imagine, we're now going to move the tape forward, and I want to show you the exact same picture 20 years later at the end of 2002. Can we see the next one? Okay, so things changed a bit, right? The action has been where we are right now. I say this as somebody who lives on the East Coast. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That is not where the action is. The growth, the action has been right out here. And in particular, you notice the bubbles get very big. You notice they're very, very green. And a lot of them have the black borders around them. And if you look at the rest of the country, the growth rate is positive, but it's kind of underwhelming. There are some younger companies. You don't see very many thick black borders. The rest of the country has not done a great job of turning out big, valuable, high-tech companies. That's where we were at the end of 2022, which I think everybody in this room remembers was a very bad year for the valuations of tech companies. So I want to draw one more picture. Hold on just a second, please. At this point, at the end of 2022, even with the miserable year that tech had, about 47% of the total value in America's large companies at that point had moved west. And when I say west, we're talking about Northern California and up in the Seattle area. Now, I redrew this visualization as of about 4 days ago, so let's see what happened. This is what happened after one very good year for tech. So you'll notice, if you pay any attention to the rest of the country, that clump got bigger. It was a good year throughout the stock market. It was a really good year for tech, to the point that the cluster is kind of metastasizing and is now about to escape from the borders of my slide. Almost 60% of the large company value in America is now here on the West Coast. This is a striking shift in how and where value gets created in a large, mature, very advanced economy like America's. And to quote one of Carl's favorite bands, Buffalo Springfield, there's something happening here. It wasn't exactly clear to me what it was, and the book is actually my answer to what the heck is happening here.
Okay, so
and we're just about out of time. Thank you very much.
So the book is The Geek Way. We did a poll with the audience.
Yeah, let's do it.
What does geek mean? So can you show us the results?
We see a word cloud. Do we have it yet? Oh.
There it is.
Yep.
Is they just in?
Oh, I love it. Yep.
Curious, nerd, smart, focused.
Exactly. So my working definition of a geek, which I talk about in the book a lot, is very close to what we see up here. Oh yeah, and then there's the word on the outside is one that I love. Could we get the word cloud back up? I want to point out a couple things. My definition of a geek is an obsessive maverick. So you see curious and obsessed there, a focused, and then on the outside you'll see that word outsider, which I think is exactly right. To me, a geek is anybody who gets obsessed with a problem, can't let it go, works on it tenaciously, and if the solutions they come up with are not mainstream, are not part of the status quo, or a little bit outside the conventional wisdom, the geeks don't care. They will pursue their inquiries wherever they lead the geek. So for me, a geek is an obsessive maverick. The geeks that I got obsessed about and led to this book are the geeks like you who are trying to run companies in an era of very rapid change and lots of technological progress. And the punchline of the book is actually really simple. I think you and your peers have experimented and iterated your way into a better way to run a company. Full stop. Not perfect, it's still going to improve, but it's better than what we came up with over the 20th century.
And that's the geek way. And that's the geek way.
The geek way is what you and your buddies have come up with.
Got it. So one of the things that you did, there are two threads that I found all through the book. One is you identify these 4 kinds of behaviors.
Yep.
That not every one of the geek companies exhibits.
Correct.
Or doesn't exhibit to the same amount. But you thought they were kind of defining characteristics of what enabled them to build such successful companies, such hugely valuable companies. You want to just I'm sure some of the people in the audience have read the book, but for anyone, just give us like the outline of what are those 4 characteristics that are so different, and maybe even contrast it with what went on with old line, kind of the gray companies.
Yeah, so my homework for myself on this book was to try to identify not just the things that you all do out here in Silicon Valley, but what are the really striking and important, meaningful differences between what you all do and what the incumbents of the industrial era are still doing, what the gray bubbles in the rest of the country are still. What are you guys doing that's so different? And you said characteristics. I want to use a little bit sharper word. I want to use the word norms, which has a pretty specific definition.
Yep.
A norm is a behavior that the people around you expect out of you. It's in the air. Whether or not the CEO talks about it in the annual report, whether or not it's on the inspirational poster on the wall, these are the things that your peers, that your social environment expects out of you. And the answer that I came to, that the kind of the heart of the Geek Way, is 4 of these doohickeys. To go through them super quickly, the first one is science. Make decisions based on evidence, not charisma, not seniority, not PowerPoint, not previous track record, but evidence. And the other critical part is argue about that evidence. Science is an argument with a ground rule. The hypothesis best supported by the evidence wins for now, and we're going to keep arguing about it. So as you well know, geeks love to argue, and you better bring your receipts, you better bring your data, right? The second one is ownership, which is finally realizing these buzzwords about empowerment and autonomy that we've been talking about. You guys have done that to a greater extent than almost any place else in the economy. You push decisions down. You have a more modular organization structure. You're not as obsessed with processing, coordination, and structure, all that. Like, give people their autonomy and let them try to go do cool things in the world. The third one is speed, which is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean iteration. I mean cadence. How quickly are you doing something, getting it out in the world, getting meaningful feedback on it, and then trying the next version of that thing? Iteration is the opposite of a ton of upfront planning. And then finally, the fourth great geek norm for me is openness, which is embodied in the willingness to pivot when something's not working, when being ready, willing, able to accept feedback and constructive criticism, and not hunkering down and getting defensive. A decent synonym for openness is psychological safety. A decent antonym is defensiveness. It's just this crouch that you get into when anyone wants to change course. Like, no, we're going to do it my way. We're going to do it the way we've been doing it. Geeks are more open, like, no, that's a better idea. Let's go do that. So and as you say, I don't know a company that does all 4 of these all the time, that does any of them perfectly, but to me these are striking differences between the rules in play at the kinds of companies that you know very well versus the ones that are out there in the rest of the economy.
So let me just add, in going through this, because some of these things, defy conventional norms.
Yep.
Did you find any companies that overdo one of these things? It's like, sharing and sharing too much.
Well, in particular, the geek norm of science, of evidence-based argumentation, the geeks can take the argument part way too far. And I tell this really unhappy story in the book about Linus Torvalds and Linux. Where he built this amazing thing. It's changed the world. And he was the benevolent dictator for life, we thought, of the Linux community, except that he was an abusive jerk to his fellow community members in Linux. And he was famous for these vicious insults that he'd hurl at people over trivial things. And whenever anyone tried to push back, he would hurl more venom at them and say, you're just too thin-skinned or stupid to get. I argue, I swear at you, and there's no possible counter-argument. And there's this really sad episode where a contributor named Sage Sharp, who was working on the Linux kernel and really wanted to be part of the community, tried to reason and argue with Linus. And they said, you're so respected in this community, what you say matters, and you're behaving like this. And Linus shot them down. And they eventually went and did something else with their career. And then eventually, Torvalds himself had to step down because he was confronted with this pattern of behavior. And he said, he stepped away from the community. It's a huge loss. And he said, look, I'm sorry. I'm not very good at this social stuff. I did some things that were dumb. And everybody involved in Linux, I think, is worse off as a result of him. If he had managed to control his behavior and not be so viciously argumentative. So the geeks can take it too far, absolutely.
One of the other things I was thinking about is, as you look at it, one of the companies right near here, incredibly successful, is Apple.
Yep.
It's not really famous for any of the 4 norms.
I
know you do.
But you don't think they exhibit any of them?
No, I think you grasped at a straw. To,
Find one piece of evidence that supports?
Well, so what I was going to say is, none of the four norms are really supported. You know, the one in particular is science. You know, Steve Jobs himself said, customer doesn't know what they want until I figure it out for them.
Yeah.
And then you go and find some example with a blurry image in the camera and go, oh yeah, Apple fits right in.
Yeah.
So I was like,
no, you're right. You're right. Clearly.
So, okay, at least you give me that. So now the question is, were there other companies that are hugely successful, that are the big bubbles, that you found that like challenged your hypothesis?
As I said, I don't know of any company that follows all four of these all the time.
Right.
And in particular, Jobs was an absolute visionary. And he didn't need all the data from the customer survey to go change the world, right? The number of people who think they're the next Steve Jobs is much greater than the number of people who are the next Steve Jobs, right? Almost infinity greater.
Exactly.
But I don't agree that Apple really doesn't exhibit these norms. They do believe in agile methods very quickly. They have an iterative approach to their software, to their hardware. They don't follow the waterfall method to go build their software.
I would say they iterate. On the other hand, you have 7 years and you have AirPods. You know, it's like...
You want to argue with their market cap?
Nope. Yeah. Not at all.
And then another thing, they're a famously secretive company.
Famously.
Right? But the geeks believe in more modular organizations. They are not fans of this mania that we got into in the 90s, where everything's a cross-functional process and we're going to map out all the coordination. That's a recipe for bureaucracy and sclerosis. It just leads to these encumbered organizations. So I actually think Apple's preference or fondness for very siloed teams and projects, this is actually a pretty smart modular idea because it prevents that kind of overgrowth from cropping in. And I think bureaucracy is probably the greatest creeping danger for any company, geek or not.
So did you find any other companies that are hugely successful and in that vein, but don't really exhibit many of these norms? Were there any that challenged you other than Apple?
Apple's the clearest example of, because they're this weird outlier out here in the valley. But as I said, they do a couple of these things. I haven't come across any company that's in this my mental category of geek that believes in an elaborate upfront planning process and then you're going to build it once and the market's going to love it.
Right.
It's just not how you go about things.
Got it.
Right? And I see so many companies in the industrial era doing this huge amount of upfront work and they sketch everything out and then they get ta-da and it sucks and they're surprised about why. It's a very, very striking difference. I also, I think there's a huge difference in kind of the ambient egalitarianism out here versus in most of the rest of the economy. Like when you ran Autodesk, plenty of your employees probably felt very free to voice their opinions even if they didn't agree with yours, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Probably.
No, actually, my real belief that to be a leader was this weird combination of strong beliefs loosely held.
And being willing to change.
That was the loosely held.
That was loosely held.
The strong belief. People don't want to follow someone. Like, you don't want to get up in front of an audience of 20,000 people and say, well, I don't know really what we should be doing.
Yeah.
So strong belief, but loosely held, meaning willing to be challenged. This is the best idea we have until confronted with a better idea.
But then you were probably willing to say, this is a better, I'm going to do this thing.
Absolutely.
Now. But I contrast that. Jack Welch has his book titles are great titles for like the dominant philosophy of the industrial era, which we should not be doing anymore, right? One was called, I'm not making this up, one of Jack Welch's books is called Straight from the Gut. Like, I don't need your evidence, right? The other one was just called Winning. Just this like, you have to win all the time. Like, you got to beat up your colleagues. You just got to dig in your heels. Terrible, right? And I contrast that with Bezos saying in a shareholders letter not too long ago, I guarantee you, he said this to his investors, right? We are incubating multi-billion-dollar failures inside Amazon right now.
Right.
He said for a company of our scale, if we're not experimenting and failing at that level, we are not taking enough risks. We're not being innovative enough.
Right. You
look at what happened with
multi-billion-dollar businesses if you don't
fail. And so, like, you look at Alexa. That probably spent a few $billion. Not money well spent in the era of generative AI. I don't think that's cause for great gnashing of teeth inside Amazon. Right?
By the way, at some point we're going to turn to audience questions. So
I hope so.
Use your app and they show up here and I will ask Andy those questions. So you use it and I think you get to vote on them and upvote them and the most popular ones. So I've read a lot of business books. There's very few things I regret in life.
Reading business books is
one of them. Like,
gosh, thanks.
every hour I make. No, most of them, I mean, they really suck.
To be okay, a lot of them suck, and there are many that were a really good article, and then they turn into 200 pages worth.
It's an interesting idea, and they make 300 pages out of it, and you're like, I would have liked the HBR article about it. But there's a handful that have, lasting ideas. Yeah. We've talked about like Christensen.
Sure.
And I know he's a mentor to you, and kind of disruption. Actually, what's interesting in the time that's passed between I read the draft and now, the thing that has stuck with me most in this book, and I thought was the most unusual, is all the work that you did on kind of cultural evolution, evolutionary biology, neuroscience. That to me was like an aha. And I'm like, did you have an aha moment? How did you take these two disparate, I mean, it's not obvious. Someone could categorize those 4 norms easily. And never bring up this idea of cultural evolution. So maybe just share the idea. And I'm just kind of curious, how did you get from here to there?
I honestly don't remember the exact genesis story, but I've always read about, I read Stephen Jay Gould books when I was a kid writing about evolution. I've read Steven Pinker's books talking about we are a species on the planet. We have these weird characteristics. It's not correct to look at us as a thing that's outside evolution. And at some point I started to think, wait a minute, maybe thinking about how this species gets things done in the world, and in particular, what makes us so good at doing things, that might be relevant to the work of trying to run a company. And via some weird paths, I came across this relatively new scientific discipline. It goes by a bunch of labels. I like cultural evolution for it, that basically looks at us, and I'm terribly paraphrasing this entire discipline, right? Looks at us and says, wait a minute, there's one species on the planet Earth that builds spaceships. There's one. There's no ambiguity about that, right? And none of us here are expecting the dolphins or the chimpanzees or the termites to be launching spaceships anytime soon. So this is interesting. What is it about us? And the first naive answer is we have great big brains, which is true and not very helpful, right? For all kinds of reasons that I go into. What actually is going on is that we are the only species on the planet that does 2 things. That comes together in very, very large numbers of non-kin, and cooperates intensely with them. There were 70 million combatants in World War II. This is large-scale, intense cooperation. We weren't all related to each other. That's number 1. Number 2, we learn faster than any other species on the planet. Chimpanzees have culture. I love this quote in the book where a psychologist said, 10,000 years ago, the pinnacle of chimpanzee culture was sticking a twig into a termite mound to get termites out. Today, the pinnacle of chimpanzee culture is sticking a twig into a termite mound to get termites. How are we doing this? We learn from each other in all these weird, obvious, and very subtle ways where our brains are these learning machines. And I'm like, wait a minute. That gives us something to hold on to. Because what is it? What is it about our wiring that lets us cooperate intensely and learn from each other so well? And what I think you and your peers have tapped into, without cultural evolution was not around when you were starting your career, right? It's a relatively young discipline. You have backed into a style of running a company that if you brought together a really good crowd of cultural evolution scientists and said, okay, design how you'd run a company, your blueprint would come closest. So for example, the huge benefit of these agile approaches to building things is that you're getting more chances to learn. You're unlocking that learning superpower. The norm of science deals with this incredibly pernicious, very common human bias of overconfidence. You and I and everybody in this room, we're chronically overconfident. You can't train it away. I think it's almost impossible to do. What you can do is harness it. And what the great geek norm of science does is it doesn't say, no, don't be overconfident. It says, no. The way you're going to win the race of science is by producing evidence. And then our brains go, great, you're going to be the best evidence producer out there. You go get that evidence. And you're going to bring it, you're going to argue with your colleagues. The other thing that science does is we are terrible, because we're so overconfident, we are innately terrible at evaluating our own ideas. Or we're too fond of them. Like, your kids are all beautiful, your ideas are all beautiful. We are really good at evaluating other people's ideas. So the reason that science is a group level process, not an individual one, is we go off and we gather, here's my hypothesis, and then everybody else bangs on it.
Right.
And so activating the energy of the group in ways like that is a huge part of what the reason science works so well, and the reason science-y kinds of organizations have a huge advantage over their competition.
So in some way you would say the best performing companies have tapped into the positive aspects.
And channeled the negative ones and dealt with the negatives. I think the hardest one to deal with probably is because we're such a social species. Every social mammal and bird has a hierarchy. That's just part of being a social species. The higher you are on that hierarchy, that status hierarchy, the better things are for you. Your fitness, your reproductive fitness goes up. It's what evolution deeply cares about. We are the most social species on the planet. Holy cow, do we care about status? Right? And again, you're not going to train that out. You're going to say, Carl, stop caring right. No. But what the geeks do is they try hard to channel our relentless desire for higher status so that it's aligned with the goals of the company. And this is where the modular part comes in. They try to remove opportunities to gain status that don't help the company. This is my very short explanation for bureaucracy. It comes from, and this is most of it is subconscious. Most of what we do is below the level of conscious awareness. We invent work, we better run that by me before it goes out the door. You know, somebody had fraud on their expense report. Well, we better have a sign-off process for every expense over $50 and it should go. We make this stuff, and if we don't check that, the lure of bureaucratization is irresistible, and it will happen to a company.
And wildly, we kind of backed into it, reverse engineered it.
You guys have reversed engineered it.
Because, and this was all through experimentation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 40, 50, 60 years of experimentation that got there, because nobody did it as a discipline, nobody studied it.
And I don't think you and your peers said, you know what, we're just evolutionarily wired for high stats.
We're really looking for stats. I mean, we never had that. I mean, and that's what was novel in the book was.
But I do think what you and your peers did is look at the companies that we built up over the 20th century and we got some things right, but holy cow, they have, in general, the older you get, the bigger you get, you become a bureaucratic, slow-moving mess. And what you and your peers did is do some very serious thinking about how do we avoid that for as long as possible.
Got it. So when you think about the old gray companies, some of them were hugely successful in their time.
Yep.
They must have been doing something right.
They took advantage of economies of scale.
Okay.
Right? So in the first part of the 20th century, we built the modern corporation. We took advantage of these huge economies of scale, took advantage of the railroad and the telegraph and electrification. We could now address a huge market. You have to build a company that can do that.
Right.
And so you have to have hierarchy.
Yep.
You have to have some structure. You've got to have professionalization. You can't have your nephew running the company forever and ever. Those are not bad ideas. And there's a great quote from Weber, one of the founders of sociology in the book. And he was talking about bureaucracy. And he said, look, if you think you're going to get the work of a modern organization done without a bunch of people sitting in offices, you're nuts. I'm paraphrasing, right? And some level of structure and process and bureaucracy is necessary to run a company. What you guys want to figure out is what's the minimum level of that we need, because the tendency is to get fond of it and keep doing it and keep thinking that you're going to solve the problem with one more layer of process or structure or sign-off or approval or whatever. And this daring thing, the geeky thing is to say, you know what? I'm going to let that go, man.
Yeah.
And there's going to be chaos as a result. Reed Hastings, in his great book, No Rules, Rules, says, look, we stopped having our people submit expenses for approval before they went out the door. And they didn't do the auditing part carefully enough. And they had an employee for a while who ran about $100,000 of luxury vacations before they caught the guy.
They worked at Autodesk too.
Then he went and worked for you for a while, right? And he had a great career. So they fired the guy. But then the really hard part was what Hastings said is what we didn't do is set up a formal prior approval process for your expenses before you could take a trip. We're not doing that. We will take that. We got to improve our auditing.
That risk.
Right? Yeah. And we need to write better software but we're not, we're going to remove that reflexive desire to solve things with more encumbrance.
Okay, so you have this ode to valley companies and valley culture. If I was an exec sitting in a traditional company, a traditional industry, and I read this book, I'd be awfully depressed.
With good reason, right? No, I mean that seriously, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, Mike, a bunch of questions there. Like, should I be depressed? Are all these old companies going to be replaced by companies that adopt these new norms?
I would hope that if you're running a successful incumbent company, and let's say like you read the Geek Way and you buy it to some extent, if that doesn't make you nervous, I have not done my job.
Got it.
I really don't think I've done my job.
Okay, but if you were that exec, and you walk into your gigantic healthcare or energy or transport, car maker, what do you do Monday morning differently?
Call me as the first thing,
right?
Because maybe we can work something out, right? That's super important. But you, in the book, I talk about some ways to start. One thing you can do, I put in each of the chapters about the norms, has a little survey at the end.
Yes.
Says, ask your people what they think about these things. How are we doing? Do you feel like you've got the responsibility that you need to?
I think it just added to their depression.
But then
quantified their depression.
You know what to go do about it. I don't think it's impossible for the old dogs to learn these new tricks. My best evidence for that is Microsoft, which, as you remember, they were still a large, profitable company, but as far as innovation or mojo, they were dead. They were an afterthought in the tech industry, man, for the first decade of this century. And then in 2014, Nadella takes over as CEO, and the world was not expecting anything like what happened, right? This astonishing creation of value.
Totally amazing.
Amazing work as a leader, and I had the chance to interview him for the book. And I didn't want to talk about strategy. He's done super smart strategic things. I didn't want to talk about that. I said, you took over this bureaucratic, encumbered, super political organization full of infighting and really burned out people. How did you turn that around?
Yeah.
So, in chapter 5 of the book, I tried to convey a lot of what I learned from him. He did some brilliant things. One of the things he did was to stop some of this incredible gatekeeping that goes on inside companies. He said, look, you can't own access to code or data inside Microsoft, with guardrails, right? Yeah. But if you want to go train up a model on all the code that exists, you go do that, man. You don't have to go through any kind of management approval.
And you got Copilot.
You got Copilot as a result. And the other thing he did, which I think is brilliant, is he kept on talking about one Microsoft. And that sounded to me like just CEO speak. You got to say something when you get up in front of the troops, right? And then I realized part of our deep wiring is that we are an incredibly tribal species. The instant there's an us, there's a them. And inside Microsoft, it was all inside Microsoft who the them was. And part of Nadella's brilliance was saying, no, Microsoft is the tribe. Microsoft is the unit. Now let's go beat up on our competitors out there in the tech industry. He just did a number of things that were so smart.
Got it. So one of the things, you got incredible access to everyone who runs these. I mean, it was kind of an amazing who's who.
Many parts of writing a book are not great fun, right? the great fun is the early stages when you call up your favorite geeks and say, hey man, can I come talk to you? And you and I had a bunch of conversations. I got to do that with a couple handfuls of amazing geeks. And the part that I loved was when I brought up this question of what do you all do that's so different from those gray bubbles? Yeah. That sparked some fascinating conversations.
So a couple things. So first of all, of these people you talked to, were there anyone who stands out as like being particularly...
Are you fishing for compliments, Carl?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, was there anyone particularly surprising?
They were.
And you talk about, the press secretary, this thing of overvaluing our own ideas. And I would have just suspected that that's the moment in which a CEO turns on their press secretary and starts telling you all.
No, what you and all,
that's not what came out.
No, what you and all your peers said, because I asked some flavor of a question, have you guys nailed this, right? Are the big green bubbles always going to just keep getting bigger over time? And all of you said, what are you, high? Silicon Valley leaders are not a terribly humble lot. But I didn't hear once, present company not accepted, but I didn't hear once from you or any of your colleagues, we've got this figured out, we're going to be on top forever. Instead, you and your peers realize that not only is the competition nasty, the internal work is really, really hard to stay sharp over time.
Got it.
So it's kind of like I have trouble picking out my favorite interview of all of them. One of the things that I loved was talking to some of the younger people who were leading really impressive organizations. Right. So I got to talk to Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, who's just a ridiculously thoughtful person.
Right.
right? So it was like, I was just taking notes as quickly as I could. Eric and I talked to him back way for a second machine age, and we're like, keep listening to that guy, right? But just the opportunity to pick the brains and to pose these kinds of questions, I learned a ton. One of my favorite quotes, one of the ones is when you and I talked, and we talked about these companies they don't have the secret of eternal youth, but they can probably stay healthier longer into middle age than our dads did.
Yeah.
That's no small thing.
No, absolutely.
Right? Like healthy years of life is a great big deal. I think you guys have figured out, if not immortality, then more healthy years of life. Steve Jurvetson, who you know, turned that around and he said, look, I see dead companies all over the place.
They just don't know it yet.
They just don't. He said they're zombies. They don't know it yet. It's like the little kid in the
No, there's no
Sense.
inalienable right for companies to exist.
But he said, if you don't realize, I love this quote from Steve. He said, if you don't realize that the way that we geeks make software now is the way that everything is going to be made. It's already happening. It doesn't, bits versus atoms doesn't matter. This approach to executing complicated projects that we pioneered in the Valley, if you don't realize that's the way every big complicated thing should get done, if you're not pivoting very hard in that direction, I see dead companies.
Got it.
Right? And when I look at Tesla's ability to update the software for its car, to build its cars in this very iterative fashion, to update them. And I look at all the legacy automakers, man, it's not a fair fight right now.
Yep.
It really isn't.
Yeah.
Now, is that going to change? And do we need to take that?
Nah. Okay, so when you talked to all these, were these would you have, like, if you had to write down at the beginning of this investigation what you thought the norms were and what came out, were they surprising? Were they different?
I had a vague idea. I hadn't crystallized. I hadn't settled on 4. Like 8 is way too many. One of the best pieces of
this
advice.
guy has 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got about speaking in public was what my mentor said. If you ever find yourself on stage saying, and sixthly, you're in deep trouble, right? So there had to be a small number of things, but I was talking to a buddy of mine, Erezio Eli, just a brilliant guy, wrote a great game theory, applied accessible game theory book called Hidden Games, and I was shooting my mouth out about these things. He said, "What are they? What are these things?" And I'm like, "Well, they're principles," and he's like, "Are they norms?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah, thanks, E. They're norms. They're things that this is critical, right? If your peers expect this of you, that's the community policing that makes culture stick. If what your peers want out of you is different than what's on the wall, the peers are what's going to carry the day, right? And so these healthy norms, and once I had the idea of a norm, that fits right into all the thinking from the discipline of cultural evolution.
Right.
That was kind of when the package started to come together, and I started to say to myself, I think you've got something.
Yeah, and then you chose your favorite number, and
and
then you have a book.
Yeah, and like 2's not enough, then you're not a smart guy, and 8 is way too many, so 4, I can do geometric growth.
I think that's good. There's a number of questions that come up, and in talking to people about this, it goes back to all the other people who work in those great companies.
Yeah.
And when I've mentioned to various people, first thing that comes out of their mouth is, my company, it's a heavily regulated industry, it's compliant. I mean, they all have excuses.
They all have excuses.
Their press secretary goes into overdrive.
Immediately, and we have a very deep status quo bias for all kinds of fairly deep evolutionary reasons. We don't want things to change. That's not good.
So what do you say to these people who, on one hand, because there's this contradiction. Oh yeah, I see, these are the most successful companies. I work hard to make my company, but my compliance officer sits at my desk. My general counsel is in my office every afternoon.
And we've been very successful. Like, we're a large, successful company in our industry, and we have a growth plan for the 21st century that looks very much like Amazon's, and we're pretty proud of that growth plan that we have. So there are all these reasons why the initial reaction is to find ways that this notion won't apply to them. And so breaking through that is actually kind of difficult homework. I fall back on something that Clay Christensen, who was a mentor of mine, I taught when I was a little baby professor. He was already this giant, he's a literal giant, he's a huge guy. But he kept on saying, first of all, he said, look, we have to stop dumbing down what we academics do. He said, managers are voracious consumers of theory. Give them a way to think about the world. And he said, if you want to convince them, there's like a tripod, right? You have to give them a theory, a story about why the world works the way it does. You have to give them data, and you have to tell them a vivid story. So that's kind of what I try to do. The other thing that I've learned is if you tell them a vivid story about the industry next door to theirs, then they can make the mental leap.
Got it.
Right? If you tell them about them and their industry, like, you don't know my industry, things are. If you say, man, the lawnmower industry is just getting murdered, then the car makers go, oh, shit. I feel a little lawnmower-y over here.
Okay, so one of the questions I was thinking about is, you've been an educator, you have a long educational career. A lot of the way schools are structured, from elementary school all the way through graduate school, was to provide bodies and minds.
And squash the joy out of you.
For the industrial age. I mean, we were going to beat you into submission so you would be a good factory worker.
Yeah. The problem is, we're not exaggerating. And I learned this as I was researching the book. My geek hero, and I talk about this in the introduction of the book, the patron saint of geeks to me is Maria Montessori, who was just this obsessive maverick about how do young kids learn? How do we do this? And I was lucky enough to be a Montessori kid for the earliest years of my education. Like there's a Montessori mafia in tech, Larry and Sergey and Jeff Bezos. And the research is fairly clear that that style of education is super overrepresented among the geeks out here. And the researchers who have looked at it said what it doesn't do is try hard to drive the joy out of you. And I found this crazy quote from a philosopher, first half of the 19th century Prussian philosopher who greatly influenced their school system, which greatly influenced our school system, which is still the one that dominates today. Sit in a desk, teacher inflicts something different on you every hour. And this guy literally said, the purpose of education is to drive the free will out of the child so they will be an obedient member of our society. I'm not making this up. Like, holy cow, that's saying the quiet part out loud, right?
Exactly.
So, let's not do that, right? And what Montessori said is, let the kid. We're learners. Kids want to learn. Let's go do that.
So beyond Montessori for the beginning, it still seems like you look at the successful companies, you look how people are working together in these groups, calling on their ultra-social nature. What would you do all through it? I mean, there's got to be more to do. I mean, there's nothing in an undergraduate or graduate education that gets you really ready to participate in these companies.
One of my lines that I learned from you that I say over and over, and you told me a while back, when I walk around the halls of Autodesk, this is when you're still running the company, you said, I don't see anybody doing a problem set. It's just not a thing that happens, right?
Exactly.
But here we are, we still work in way too isolated a way. We work on little mini problems, and that's starting to change. But this notion that education and learning is an inherently group level activity, and that doing things, building things, making things, and getting feedback on them is a way to actually accelerate that learning, that has not penetrated education nearly enough.
Yeah, and you talk about, the Tom Wujek, the experiment that starts with the spaghetti and the marshmallows and building a tower. And always, who are the worst performers?
So the best exercise, if you're trying to get these points across and you need to do it in front of a group, the best exercise is called the Marshmallow Challenge. And all you do is get for every team, 4 to 6 people, get them a meter of uncooked spaghetti, a meter of string, and a meter of masking tape, and a marshmallow, fresh, not stale. And then each table's job is to build the tallest tower that they can using only those ingredients. It has to be a freestanding tower on the base. Go, you've got 18 minutes. And the people who do best are, no surprise, architects and engineers. CEOs do pretty well. Lawyers do a really bad job. The worst by far, and I will vouch for this because I've done it a few times, are MBA students who spend the first half of their time in status transactions. Who's the CEO of Spaghetti Corps here? Who are we going to listen to? And it's usually the least qualified person. And then they spend the next 7-8 minutes sketching out exactly what they're going to do. And they build a tower and they put the marshmallow on top. And the marshmallow is reality, represents reality in this exercise. Because when you put it on top of some inherently flimsy spaghetti, it goes along with the hopes and dreams of the team, right? And so I love doing this with MBAs because you just watch reality intrude on their plans. Aside from architects and engineers, the people who do the best on the Marshmallow Challenge, no joke, are kindergarten students. Because what they literally do is they just start grabbing marshmallows and string, they start building stuff and talking with each other, and they build these crazy, crazy psychedelic towers that don't look like the Eiffel Tower, but they actually stand up fairly tall. And it just gets to this basic idea. The way to go accomplish something difficult is to try stuff over and over. And I had my wings clipped on this a little bit by Will Marshall, CEO, founder of Planet, who puts satellites up in space. And I was going on about this iterative approach, and Will says, oh, okay, stop. Like, when you're doing systems engineering, there's some minimum upfront planning that has to happen. You gotta write some stuff down and coordinate. And he said, look, you can't launch the satellite and go, oh shit, we forgot the radio. Let's try to iterate again. He said that doesn't work. Right. So he talked me off of my ledge about, oh, just iterate. But he said, I became convinced, he was a scientist at NASA, like you know. He said, I became convinced that we were just at NASA. We were too fond of all the upfront stuff. We were too fond of getting everything, dealing with every contingency, 5 nines, all of that. And we were taking too long, and things were costing way, way too much money. And that was the founding of Planet.
Yeah. Do you see any change at MIT or down the road, down Mass Ave? I mean, you have thousands of students coming through this. They are going to lead these corporate, yet it seems like the curriculum seems kind of like
it's getting better than it used to be.
You already have tenure, come on.
No, but I talk about in the book the craziest course that I ever tried to take. I tried to take it during the pandemic. And there's a course called How to Make Almost Anything at MIT, which is exactly what it sounds like. And it's taught even by MIT standards, kind of a mad genius scientist dude who you know, named Neil Gershenfeld. He's a legitimately crazy guy, but in a good way.
Totally crazy.
Crazy. But Neil said, in one semester, I'm going to take these MIT students. I don't care so much about their prereqs or where they walk in. In one semester, I'm going to teach them how to make almost anything. And that includes embedded devices and Arduino and laser cutting and three-dimensional printing and CAD and in one semester, right?
It is totally an amazing class.
It's an amazing class, which I could not keep up with, I tell you here. I tried to take this, and I was like, I got 3 weeks into it, and I was feeling so beat up, and I was getting behind, and I'm like, you're actually too old for this, aren't you? You literally cannot hang with the kids anymore. But I was watching these children around me just like, okay, and they went off and did that thing for the week, and the whole point is you don't have time to plan. You got to go build something every week. You got to bring it to class. Neil might cold call you, and you got to explain and show the thing. And then the next week, you're going to do something that relies on everything you've learned, plus 1 additional week of crazy work.
I'm just laughing to myself because I had this funny experience. Neil sends me an email Friday afternoon a few years ago. Says, I want to come visit your workshop. I'm only in town till 11 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yep.
So I rearranged my whole Saturday morning to accommodate Neil. Around 9 o'clock at night, he sends me a reading list of everything he's ever written on the subject that he expects me to read.
To have absorbed.
Before our thing. So not keeping him in his class is partially you, but it might be a little bit Neil.
But the crazy thing is the great majority of students can actually get through it. A, because they're young and they have all the energy in the world. But the thing that Neil does, in addition to asking so much out of them, the resources for the course are fantastic. There's a dedicated core of teaching assistants who will help you with your nonsense.
They're awesome.
But there's an archive of every previous version of the class, the code, the CAD files, your documentation. You're required to do that, and therefore you have models to draw on when you're starting something new.
And that to me is an example that I was probing at about graduate school. What he does so well, like the thing I hate when I see design schools, architecture schools, you're going to have a term project, a semester. And it's exactly the opposite of what I found in the world of designing and building things and you found in the world of companies. It's the opposite of iteration.
Yeah.
And so you have your capstone project, okay, 4 years, and
I did one thing in 4 years. No.
And you have none of the skills necessary to go in the world. And so Neil's class is just so good at going, just do it quickly, try it, learn, fail, learn something, and try it again.
And in addition to the skills, which are pretty amazing if you can hang with the class, the mindset of that's the right way to go do things. That really, even my 12 days in the class, I acquired more of that mindset. It's really, really important for a ton of reasons that I talk about in the book. One of them is that the way we learn is lots of models and lots of generations. Iterate, new generation. You have lots of models to draw on. Our brains are weirdly good at creating a weighted average of the best stuff we see out there and applying it to the task at hand. So this iterative approach taps into one of our absolute human superpowers. If you're not doing that, if you're not iterating, you're just leaving that superpower on the shelf. It's a terrible idea.
Yeah. By the way, we have another poll that we were supposed to do at this point. So
Hey, you're the MC here. Like,
I'm doing a great job.
you make it happen.
Okay. In your organization, which aspect of the Geek Way do you think most needs to be improved? Answers are all in?
Wait, we're gonna wait.
Come on.
Interesting. Look at that. Wait, hold on.
It's changing.
There's still oh,
Live voting.
yep. Wow, it's a tie.
Polls are closing in Ohio. Let's.
Oh, that, wow, it changed places.
Indecision 2023.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's back up top.
Really close.
There's this super depressing research that I talk about in the chapter on ownership. Gary Hamel and Michela Zanini, the two management researchers, did a bureaucracy survey with the readers of Harvard Business Review, and their conclusions are just dire. Right, they're just dire. And the average organization has stultifying bureaucracy. The average large organization is just impossible to get anything done. And the amount of autonomy that most companies give their people is ridiculous. Like most people are not free to go spend $1,000 without running it up so many different flagpoles.
It's crazy.
It's legit. You're hiring adults, and you're trying to run a large enterprise, and you put these picayune barriers in their way. But again, it's not done deliberately. It's a thing that accrues, that accretes over time. And if you don't keep whacking it back, it's going to keep growing.
Yeah, no, it absolutely. There's kind of this funny thing. I don't think the leader of even the gray bubble companies want them to be that way.
No one. Oh, great! I built a stultifying bureaucracy
where everyone hates their job and has to ask 7 people for approval.
I tell the story in the book about a manager who was working at Hewlett-Packard in 2005.
Oh yeah, that's a great story.
And she needed to spend about $250,000 on outside consultants for a pretty big project. And so she said, "Great, put it in the thing." Went through the process, and she found out she needed 20 signatures to get this spending approved. And not just her boss and her boss's boss. And she said people in parts of the company I had never heard of before needed to sign off on this. And she found this procurement office in Acapulco. There were the final 3 signatures. And she said, I started calling them every day, begging, trying to find somebody who could get this done. And she said, I became such good friends with one of the people that worked in this office that needed to sign off on my project that they asked me to endorse them on LinkedIn for, I don't know, excessive bureaucracy. But no one at HP designed that process. It's just what happens if you don't watch out. Because we people are we people.
And my experience, and I'm just curious yours, if you look at the companies, even the big green ones, it's happening there as we speak.
Yes, it is. Right? So Brad Stone wrote 2 really good books about Bezos and Amazon. He said by the teens, Bezos' main job was trying to whack back the encroaching bureaucracy at Amazon and keep it that 2-pizza team, super modular kind of organization. That tendency is so pervasive that it happens to the best managed companies out there. Right? And the problem is there are so many different flavors. There's the 20 signature flavor of bureaucracy, and then there's soft bureaucracy, which is, we should just run this by Carl before we go ahead. We should just make sure Carl's on board with it. And until Carl has a chance to hear about it or not, we're not going to take action here.
The worst words I ever heard in my company is Carl says.
Yeah.
Carl said this. I remember this horrible story. I go to the gym in our building one day, and I'm on the thing, and there's this guy next to me, and he looks exhausted, but he's pedaling away, and he says, I've pulled 2 all-nighters working on that presentation for you. And I'm embarrassed to say, I have no idea what this guy is.
Which one?
I'm looking forward to see. But that's how companies run. I mean, that is that whole status thing. It's, having the meetings.
It's a combination of this, of our status seeking and this approach from the top that says, I can rationally design the way we're going to run this organization. I can map out all the processes we need. That will get you in such deep trouble. Yeah. So I think the geeks believe not just in minimum viable product, not just that MVP, but minimum viable plan and minimum viable process. And they keep all those minimums in mind.
Yeah, by the way, I don't think I picked on it enough, but I actually think this minimal viable product.
I know you hate this idea.
I hate this idea. Thank you. I mean, 15 seconds, because I got the stage.
Yeah, go. No, sure. No, there's your soapbox right there. This is all about you. We've realized
this. Exactly. Viability is not what you should use to describe. It's like for sperm. That's what sperm is viable or not viable.
He's here all week, folks.
Yes. No, I mean, what I've seen in the world of products even if they're immature, it's like minimally delightful.
Delightful, right.
It has to do something that the thing you already have.
That they can't let go
doesn't
of.
do. That's why they put up with all the crap.
Yep.
And this
Agreed.
MVP has turned into this excuse to have a half-assed thing released premature. You know, it's like it's like a bad waterfall.
Are you done yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's go back. Let's talk about Andy's book. Enough about me. Yeah. Or enough about you. How about me? Okay, Andy. I heard this rumor that you've started a company to consult with people about generative AI. And the question I have, it's not about generative AI. Having written this book and spent a year or two, are there things, what would you take from that? A, that you'd either apply to your company or the companies you're consulting with?
The rumor is true. Eric and I, along with two co-founders, James Mylan and Daniel Locke, have started a company. We've been on the sidelines for too long, right? It's time to get in, have some fun. And we're having, it's hard fun, but it's fun. Then the main thing that we tried to do from the jump with the company that bears some relation to the book is to make sure that certainly among the four founders and with the team so far, that we try hard to build this in very egalitarian, argumentative in a good way, not the Linus Torvalds way, but the disagree and commit kind of way. And our best discussions are when we don't agree with each other and we've all agreed to get together and hash it out. And as you well know, lots of that stuff happens in the early life of a company.
Right.
But if you set that norm of kind of, mouthy egalitarianism and openness at the start, then I think founder effects are really important, and early history is super important. And my hope is A, that we succeed, and B, that this norm of openness continues.
It doesn't surprise me that you guys would be good at argumentative stuff.
But the hard part is, because Eric and I do it just like for sport, right? It's our idea of a good time. But if we've got junior people in there, and it's kind of like mom and dad are arguing again, we have to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is a good model instead of a bad model.
Okay, so if you fast forward 5 years with this company, which of those norms do you think you guys will be good at, and which are the ones that are, because some things come naturally. And
I think the hardest one is going to be keeping out the encroachment of process and bureaucracy and all the for the really good reasons why you need a sign off on this, you need approval on this, you can't do this, and to keep it this kind of very kind of open, high ownership, high modularity, bias for action kind of a company. One of our co-founders worked at Amazon for a while, and he carries the flag about the bias for action and the ownership. So I have some hope that we'll keep that going. But there are all kinds of good reasons to layer in process and approval and bureaucracy and all that stuff. And we got to fight it.
Got it.
To the extent we're successful.
Well, Andy, this has been fantastic. And I think we're supposed to end with your one word, and so.
To the surprise of absolutely nobody here, my one word is eat.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you all.
Thank you both so much. Carl, Andy, this is a real treat. They didn't have much to say, did they? The curiosity that I have stemming from your conversation relates to the business models, and then in general the economic structures, because you talked a lot about culture and things like that. But every one of those companies found a seam to do something that maybe has been done before, but to do it better with new economics. And maybe in some cases they actually didn't invent anything, Apple being a good example of that. So anyway, fascinating conversation, and it's always a good read and things of that ilk. So I want to, again, thank the panel and the discussion tonight. There's a survey. There's going to be a little QR code. As a learning institution, we really appreciate your feedback, and I want to encourage all of you to grab that QR code. It's important for us to understand what you think and how we can improve our programs over time. That's pretty fundamental. It's something that we're measuring and monitoring across the board. We actually have some federal grants to help us sort of train the institution to be an ongoing learning institution, which is an important forward-looking thing for all of us. There's always an opportunity to go to our website and join and give. I have to say that again. And then I want to point out that the next event that we'll be holding is later in January. It turns out to be January 24th, which is the 40th anniversary of the launch of the Macintosh.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry to say, but pleased to say at the same time that the event is actually oversold beyond what which we can consume in this auditorium. But there is a waiting list, so if you want to sign up, please do that. It's obviously going to be available online and streamed, and we capture all of that for our inventory and for the history of the museum. For me personally, this is going to be a very, very fun event because I was part of the team that built that product, the first 10 or so people. And so you're going to see basically the developers and the inventors. I took it around to the university community. It's where I met people like Carl and others. Back in the day, he was at Cornell. And so join us for that program. It's going to be particularly exciting. And then last but not least, Andy, you're going to be downstairs in the lobby and signing books. So I'll encourage you all to take the time to get a copy of the book and spend a little time asking Andy questions that you didn't get to hear answers to tonight. So thank you both for coming, and thank you all for the evening. Thanks so much.